Section 33 of Villette by Charlotte Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leanne Fortune. Section 33. Monsieur Paul amused me. I smiled to myself as I watched him. He seemed so thoroughly in his element, standing conspicuous in presence of a wide and grand assemblage, arranging, restraining, overawing about 100 young ladies. He was, too, so perfectly in earnest, so energetic, so intent, and above all, so absolute. And yet what business had he there? What had he to do with music or the conservatoire, he who could hardly distinguish one note from another? I knew that it was his love of display and authority which had brought him there, a love not offensive, only because so naive. It presently became obvious that his brother, Monsieur Joseph, was as much under his control as were the girls themselves. Never was such a little hawk of a man as that Monsieur Paul. Ere long, some noted singers and musicians dawned upon the platform. As these stars rose, the comet-like professor set. Insufferable to him were all notorieties and celebrities. Where he could not outshine, he fled. And now all was prepared. But one compartment of the hall waited to be filled, a compartment covered with crimson, like the grand staircase and doors, furnished with stuffed and cushioned benches, ranged on each side of two regal chairs, placed solemnly under a canopy. A signal was given, the doors rolled back, the assembly stood up, the orchestra burst out, and, to the welcome of a choral burst, entered the king, the queen, the court of Labassecour. Till then I had never set eyes on living king or queen. It may consequently be conjectured how I strained my powers of vision to take in these specimens of European royalty. By whomsoever majesty is beheld for the first time, there will always be experienced a vague surprise, bordering on disappointment, that the same does not appear seated en performance on a throne, bonneted with a crown, and furnished as to the hand with a sceptre. Looking out for a king and queen, and seeing only a middle-aged soldier and a rather young lady, I felt half cheated, half pleased. Well do I recall that king, a man of 50, a little bowed, a little grey. There was no face in all that assembly which resembled his. I had never read, never been told anything of his nature or his habits, and at first the strong hieroglyphics graven as with iron stylet on his brow, round his eyes, beside his mouth, puzzled and baffled instinct. Ere long, however, if I did not know, at least I felt, the meaning of those characters written without hand, there sat a silent sufferer, a nervous, melancholy man. Those eyes had looked on the visits of a certain ghost, had long waited the comings and goings of that strangest spectre, hypochondria. Perhaps he saw her now on that stage, over against him, amidst all that brilliant throng. Hypochondria has that want to rise in the midst of thousands, dark as doom, pale as malady, and well nigh strong as death. Her comrade and victim thinks to be happy one moment. Not so, says she, I come. And she freezes the blood in his heart, and beclouds the light in his eye. Some might say it was the foreign crown pressing the king's brows which bent them to that peculiar and painful fold. Some might quote the effects of early bereavement. Something there might be of both these, but these are embittered by that darkest foe of humanity, constitutional melancholy. The queen, his wife, knew this. It seemed to me the reflection of her husband's grief lay, a subduing shadow on her own benignant face. A mild, thoughtful, graceful woman that princess seemed. Not beautiful, not at all like the women of solid charms and marble feelings described a page or two since. Hers was a somewhat slender shape. Her features, though distinguished enough, were too suggestive of reigning dynasties and royal lines to give unqualified pleasure. The expression clothing that profile was agreeable in the present instance, but you could not avoid connecting it with remembered effigies, where similar lines appeared, under phase ignoble, feeble, or sensual, or cunning, as the case might be. The Queen's eye, however, was her own, and pity, goodness, sweet sympathy, blessed it with divinest light. She moved no sovereign, but a lady, kind, loving, elegant. Her little son, the Prince of Labassecour, and young Duke de Dindonneau, accompanied her. He leaned on his mother's knee, and ever and anon, in the course of that evening, I saw her observant of the monarch at her side, conscious of his beclouded abstraction, and desirous to rouse him from it by drawing his attention to their son. She often bent her head to listen to the boy's remarks, and would then smilingly repeat them to his sire. The moody king started, listened, smiled, but invariably relapsed as soon as his good angel ceased speaking. Full mournful and significant was that spectacle, not the less so because, both for the aristocracy and the honest bourgeoisie of Labassecour, its peculiarities seemed to be wholly invisible. I could not discover that one soul present was either struck or touched. With the king and queen had entered their court, comprising 2 or 3 foreign ambassadors, and with them came the elite of the foreigners then resident in Villette. These took possession of the crimson benches. The ladies were seated. Most of the men remained standing. Their sable rank, lining the background, looked like a dark foil to the splendor displayed in front. Nor was this splendor without varying light, and shade, and gradation. The middle distance was filled with matrons in velvets and satins, in plumes and gems. The benches in the foreground, to the Queen's right hand, seemed devoted exclusively to young girls. The flower, perhaps I should rather say the bud, of Villette aristocracy. Here were no jewels, no headdresses, no velvet pile or silken sheen. Purity, simplicity, and aerial grace reigned in that virgin band. Young heads simply braided, and fair forms. I was going to write sylph forms, but that would have been quite untrue. Several of these jeunes filles, who had not numbered more than 16 or 17 years, boasted contours as robust and solid as those of a stout Englishwoman of 25, fair forms robed in white, or pale rose, or placid blue, suggested thoughts of heaven and angels. I knew a couple, at least, of these rose et blanche specimens of humanity. Here was a pair of Madame Beck's late pupils, Mesdemoiselles Mathilde and Angelique, pupils who, during their last year at school, ought to have been in the first class, but whose brains never got them beyond the 2nd division. In English they had been under my own charge, and hard work it was to get them to translate rationally a page of the Vicar of Wakefield. Also, during 3 months I had one of them for my vis-à-vis at table, and the quantity of household bread, butter, and stewed fruit she would habitually consume at 2nd déjeuner was a real world's wonder, to be exceeded only by the fact of her actually pocketing slices she could not eat. Here be truths, wholesome truths too. I knew another of these seraphs, the prettiest, or at any rate the least demure and hypocritical looking of the lot. She was seated by the daughter of an English peer, also an honest though haughty looking girl. Both had entered in the suite of the British Embassy. She, i.e., my acquaintance, had a slight, pliant figure, not at all like the forms of the foreign damsels. Her hair, too, was not close braided like a shell or a skull-cap of satin. It looked like hair, and waved from her head, long, curled, and flowing. She chatted away volubly, and seemed full of a light-headed sort of satisfaction with herself and her position. I did not look at Dr. Bretton, but I knew that he, too, saw Ginevra Fanshawe. He had become so quiet, he answered so briefly his mother's remarks, he so often suppressed a sigh. Why should he sigh? He had confessed a taste for the pursuit of love under difficulties. Here was full gratification for that taste. His lady-love beamed upon him from a sphere above his own. He could not come near her. He was not certain that he could win from her a look. I watched to see if she would so far favour him. Our seat was not far from the crimson benches. We must inevitably be seen thence by eyes so quick and roving as Miss Fanshawe's, and very soon those optics of hers were upon us, at least upon Dr. and Mrs. Bretton. I kept rather in the shade and out of sight, not wishing to be immediately recognized. She looked quite steadily at Dr. John, and then she raised a glass to examine his mother. A minute or two afterwards she laughingly whispered her neighbour. Upon the performance commencing, her rambling attention was attracted to the platform. On the concert I need not dwell. The reader would not care to have my impressions thereanent, and indeed it would not be worth while to record them, as they were the impressions of an ignorance crass. The young ladies of the conservatoire, being very much frightened, made rather a tremulous exhibition on the two grand pianos. Monsieur Joseph Emmanuel stood by them while they played, but he had not the tact or influence of his kinsman, who, under similar circumstances, would certainly have compelled pupils of his to demean themselves with heroism and self-possession. Monsieur Paul would have placed the hysteric debutantes between two fires, terror of the audience and terror of himself, and would have inspired them with the courage of desperation by making the latter terror incomparably the greater. Monsieur Joseph could not do this. Following the white muslin pianistes came a fine, full-grown, sulky lady in white satin. She sang. Her singing just affected me like the tricks of a conjurer. I wondered how she did it, how she made her voice run up and down, and cut such marvellous capers that a simple Scotch melody, played by a rude street minstrel, has often moved me more deeply. Afterwards stepped forth a gentleman who, bending his body a good deal in the direction of the king and queen, and frequently approaching his white-gloved hand to the region of his heart, vented a bitter outcry against a certain false Isabel. I thought he seemed especially to solicit the queen's sympathy, but, unless I am egregiously mistaken, her majesty lent her attention rather with the calm of courtesy than the earnestness of interest. This gentleman's state of mind was very harrowing, and I was glad when he wound up his musical exposition of the same. Some rousing choruses struck me as the best part of the evening's entertainment. There were present deputies from all the best provincial choral societies, genuine, barrel-shaped, native Labassecourians. These worthies gave voice without mincing the matter. Their hearty exertions had at least this good result: the ear drank thence a satisfying sense of power. Through the whole performance, timid instrumental duets, conceited vocal solos, sonorous brass-lunged choruses, my attention gave but one eye and one ear to the stage, the other being permanently retained in the service of Dr. Bretton. I could not forget him, nor cease to question how he was feeling, what he was thinking, whether he was amused or the contrary. At last he spoke. "And how do you like it all, Lucy? You are very quiet," he said, in his own cheerful tone. "I am quiet," I said, "because I am so very, very much interested, not merely with the music, but with everything about me." He then proceeded to make some further remarks with so much equanimity and composure that I began to think he had really not seen what I had seen, and I whispered, "Miss Fanshawe is here. Have you noticed her?" "Oh, yes, and I observed that you noticed her too. Is she come with Mrs. Cholmondeley, do you think?" "Mrs. Cholmondeley is there with a very grand party. Yes, Ginevra was in her train, and Mrs. Cholmondeley was in Lady's train, who was in the Queen's train. If this were not one of the compact little minor European courts, whose very formalities are little more imposing than familiarities, and whose gala grandeur is but homeliness in Sunday array, it would sound all very fine. Ginevra saw you, I think?" "So do I think so. I have had my eye on her several times since you withdrew yours, and I have had the honor of witnessing a little spectacle which you were spared. I did not ask what. I waited voluntary information, which was presently given. Miss Fanshawe," he said, "has a companion with her, a lady of rank. I happen to know Lady Sarah by sight. Her noble mother has called me in professionally. She is a proud girl, but not in the least insolent, and I doubt whether Ginevra will have gained ground in her estimation by making a butt of her neighbours." "What neighbours?" "Merely myself and my mother. As to me, it is all very natural. Nothing, I suppose, can be fairer game than the young bourgeois doctor. But my mother, I never saw her ridiculed before. Do you know, the curling lip and sarcastically levelled glass thus directed gave me a most curious sensation. Think nothing of it, Dr. John. It is not worth while. If Ginevra were in a giddy mood, as she is eminently to-night, she would make no scruple of laughing at that mild pensive queen, or that melancholy king. She is not actuated by malevolence, but sheer heedless folly. To a feather-brained schoolgirl nothing is sacred. But you forget, I have not been accustomed to look on Miss Fanshawe in the light of a feather-brained schoolgirl. Was she not, my divinity, the angel of my career?" There was your mistake. To speak the honest truth, without any false rant or assumed romance, there actually was a moment, 6 months ago, when I thought her divine. Do you remember our conversation about the presents? I was not quite open with you in discussing that subject. The warmth with which you took it up amused me. By way of having the full benefit of your lights, I allowed you to think me more in the dark than I really was. It was that test of the presents which first proved Ginevra mortal. Still her beauty retained its fascination. 3 days, 3 hours ago, I was very much her slave. As she passed me to-night, triumphant in beauty, my emotions did her homage. But for one luckless sneer, I should yet be the humblest of her servants. She might have scoffed at me, and while wounding, she would not soon have alienated me. Through myself, she could not in 10 years have done what, in a moment, she has done through my mother." He held his peace a while. Never before had I seen so much fire and so little sunshine in Dr. John's blue eye as just now. "Lucy," he recommenced, "look well at my mother, and say, without fear or favour, in what light she now appears to you." "As she always does, an English middle-class gentlewoman, well, though gravely dressed, habitually independent of pretence, constitutionally composed and cheerful. So she seems to me, bless her. The merry may laugh with mamma, but the weak only will laugh at her. She shall not be ridiculed with my consent, at least, nor without my scorn, my antipathy, my—" He stopped, and it was time for he was getting excited, more it seemed than the occasion warranted. I did not then know that he had witnessed double cause for dissatisfaction with Miss Fanshawe. The glow of his complexion, the expansion of his nostril, the bold curve which disdain gave his well-cut underlip, showed him in a new and striking phase. Yet the rare passion of the constitutionally suave and serene is not a pleasant spectacle, nor did I like the sort of vindictive thrill which passed through his strong young frame. "Do I frighten you, Lucy?" he asked. "I cannot tell why you are so very angry." "For this reason," he muttered in my ear, "Ginevra is neither a pure angel nor a pure-minded woman." "Nonsense, you exaggerate. She has no great harm in her. Too much for me. I can see where you are blind. Now dismiss the subject. Let me amuse myself by teasing mamma. I will assert that she is flagging. Mamma, pray rouse yourself. John, I will certainly rouse you if you are not better conducted. Will you and Lucy be silent, that I may hear the singing?" They were then thundering in a chorus, under cover of which all the previous dialogue had taken place. "You hear the singing, mamma. Now I will wager my studs, which are genuine, against your paste brooch." "My paste brooch? Graham, profane boy, you know that it is a stone of value." "Oh, that is one of your superstitions. You were cheated in the business." "I am cheated in fewer things than you imagine. How do you happen to be acquainted with young ladies of the court, John? I have observed 2 of them pay you no small attention during the last half hour." "I wish you would not observe them." "Why not?" "Because one of them satirically levels her eyeglass at me. She is a pretty, silly girl, but are you apprehensive that her titter will discomfort the old lady?" "The sensible, admirable old lady! Mother, you are better to me than 10 wives yet." "Don't be demonstrative, John, or I shall faint, and you will have to carry me out. And if that burden were laid upon you, you would reverse your last speech, and exclaim, 'Mother, 10 wives could hardly be worse to me than you are.'" End of section 33. Recording by Leanne Fortune.